would actually be extremely strong. We think that's going to be a problem. I'm going to talk to you now, no thank you, about the outcomes of this policy for these individuals. Firstly, the need to cooperate and the desire to cooperate would actually operate on you in the moment. So at the moment where you see a beggar on the street, you have a desire to cooperate, so you are more likely to give them money, even though that might not be the most effective thing to do for you or for that person or for society as a whole. Also, it may be that in the long run you become unhappy with the outcome. So you are more likely to give money to that beggar but have less money for yourself. You are more likely to give large amounts of money to charity and then realize that you are less able to feed your family or provide education for your own children. We think that is potentially a very negative outcome for you, and that is not something that you are able necessarily to resist if you are taking these drugs in the same way that you otherwise would be. We think in the long term there are two possibilities. Either you stop taking the drugs, at which point you have all the harms that you get from withdrawal of any drugs, particularly ones which relate to the brain, particularly ones which affect the way in which you feel happiness and release dopamines. We think that examples of this clearly exist. Any drugs for depression, any drugs that alter the state of mind, alter your mood, and the way in which you perceive the world around you. There are great harms to those individuals in that case, which make it mean that even if they stop taking the drugs because they don't like the way they make them, they're never able to get back to the person that they were before, which means they're never back to the same person that they were. So it is, in that sense, an irreversible choice no matter what. The alternative is that they continue taking these drugs. We think that that can make their life objectively worse for the reasons that I've outlined above, and we think that also it can lead to a situation where you're unable to challenge those who have pressured you into taking the drugs in the first place and say, given the opportunity again, I would not do this, because you feel that that's not an altruistic thing to do. You feel that it's calling people out on doing bad things. And we think and we think that doesn't necessarily fit with our idea of altruism, because we believe we should be kind and helpful and respectful towards others at all times. No, thank you. But we think furthermore that means that unaltruistic people therefore have a greater ability to exploit those who they might be able to get to take these drugs for their own gains. This is particularly important in situations, for example, political fields, any campaigns which go on, any charities. These may not be the best policies, the best charities for you, however, they are better able to convince you that their outcomes are the best. So presumably the point of altruism is that we help those who need the help the most. However, in the real world, in the world in which we know, the people who are best able to convince people are usually the people with the most resources, the people who are able to hire people who are specifically experienced in things like campaigns and so on, and are able to very effectively persuade people of particular things. So what actually we do by introducing these drugs of altruism is give huge power to those who already have power to convince and exacerbate that power, which means it's actually harder to fight against things like poverty, to fight against things like inequality in society, which means you end up with unaltruistic outcomes in spite of the intention and aim of creating these drugs, which is to create a greater level of altruism in society. Closing.
So one of the things that has kept poor communities back is a lack of solidarity due to a buy into individualistic capitalist culture, right? This idea that I should care about other people with me instead of buying into my own personal game and playing with the system is an exact
thank you. Okay, the first thing is, we say that empathy can be good, but it's not necessarily always good for all people in all situations. Only I live my life. I am forced to live my life. So therefore I am entitled to prioritize myself over other people to a certain degree, because I am the one who has to live in that individual state, and only I can know how good or bad I feel about the state in which I live. Secondly, though, to the extent that we accept that point of information, we say that the state and collective groups of people are better able to say where those lines should be set as to where we should give money or information or assistance to other people. Why is that? Well, we say firstly because there's an aggregation of information. Secondly, because you're simply better able to rationalize something in a more cold-hearted sense, rather than somebody whose chemicals in their brain are telling them to do something, even though they can't necessarily rationalize it or give properly weighted reasons in order to do that. So we think that it's actually stronger if you engage in that collectivization rather than what they want to do. We think furthermore that self-interest is really important in ensuring that we get the best possible outcomes, because when people are able to express their own self-interest, others can react to that. If these drugs are proliferated, then what's going to happen is loads of people are going to be acting in everybody else's interests. However, how am I supposed to help someone who is also taking these drugs and only worrying about everybody else? How do I look after that person's self-interest? Therefore, this actual proposal, if successful, their proposal becomes circular and self-defeating, because nobody's able to express their own self-interest. Therefore, we're unable to actually help those people anyway. So for all of these harms to altruism, and because we believe that people should be able to choose to prioritize themselves if they wish, we couldn't be prouder to propose.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, we set ourselves two burdens in this debate. Firstly, to prove to you why people should be allowed to make meaningful and consenting choices. And I'm going to tell you that what they gave you about supposed coercion was not sufficient to win this other debate. But secondly, I'm going to tell you, we think when people make these choices, why it is beneficial for themselves and society because they are able to overcome temporary individualistic things that pressure them away from making moral decisions that they will regret later on. Moving straight into that. But firstly, the kind of setup that we support in this debate. We don't necessarily have to support the worst form or worst model. We support government production and distribution of these types of drugs, so it's socialized. We don't have to accept drugs that necessarily fuck with people's brains after they go off them. We wouldn't allow them to move beyond research at that stage if that was the case. We don't have to accept corporate capture, control, and marketing. If anything, we'll distribute them like alcohol is distributed in Chennai, like behind a cage at some random places where it is easy to access and is not particularly marketed. Cool. Moving straight into substantive rebuttal will be integrated, Mr. Speaker. Why do people have a right to this choice? We say here that if we win this aspect of the debate, that people are able to make consenting and free decisions, we don't have to prove to you that those decisions will be particularly moral, or like there is any moral benefit from that, because we think we will defer to what is good for that individual. Notice that that is the burden that that side has set themselves by relying on the supposed point of coercion. Firstly, when morality is somewhat subjective, it's totally subjective, in fact, we support people opting for the morality that is best for them. In the status quo, this is the kind of things like where people are allowed to drink and alter their state of mind to have a better night. I refer you to the women's debate last night, Mr. Speaker. But all taking legal drugs or even doing things like exercise where they manipulate the chemical balance of their brain to feel differently and to feel better. Importantly, what this means is that you are able to opt into these particular things, and it is better for you, and we think that is, as I will prove later, better for society. I then have to prove to you that these people are making free decisions. Here's how I'm going to do that. Firstly, we think information would be provided to the extent that all the harms that they wanted to tell you about, like getting off the drugs, that you won't feel like yourself in the future, that will be put out before you take those drugs, will ensure that people are consenting and of sound mind. That's totally fair. What does this mean then in terms of like the kind of decisions, and how does this compare to decisions that we normally allow individuals to make, like working in particularly onerous jobs, performing sex work even, Mr. Speaker? There are particular risks, but as long as those individuals are aware of the harms that could accrue to them if they take those drugs, we're fine with that. They've not proved to you particularly why there was coercion, but let's look at the reasons they gave you. Firstly, it was social pressure that existed like vaccinations. Let's be clear, the counterfactual in this debate is that the after effect of not taking this drug is that you feel prolonged guilt. I'll deal with that later, but that's what needs to be balanced in this debate. That people are made to feel worse off when they regret not taking moral actions. That's why they opt into these drugs in the first place. Secondly, they brought you that there's this form of bounded rationality, that people are unable to consent to the harms even if the information is provided to them by our model. Firstly, don't take people as idiots. We're going to be a side in this debate that realizes that people often make lifelong and long-term decisions with respect to what drugs they take, which particular alcohol that they consume, which particular like platform of exercise they pursue over their life, such that their chemical balance in their brains are altered. These have long-term, long-reaching effects that can't be opted out of, especially in terms of employment contracts and particular things that you perform. In those instances, we think that is fine, and we allow people to do that. And I'll deal with you like the particular utility of that. Finally, they said that there would be marketing and corporate capture. I've dealt with that in how we've modeled this debate. Point. But like at the end of this point, we have to prove to you what's the benefit of allowing individuals to make these kind of choices. Here it is. We think this. Sorry, just getting back to my notes. We think firstly, like no, thank you. Like the first benefit is that when morality is subjective and you're able to opt into it and find a morality that is best for you, and if we treat people like not like infants who can achieve the good life and the kind of life that they want, allowing people to make free choices that allow them to be more moral means on the aggregate and collectively, those individuals are better off in society because they are pursuing a life that they want. Secondly, though, the government should not interfere and take hard-earned cash off these individuals and dictate how their work and their labor should be treated. And that kind of like that kind of theft is not legitimate or justified in that instance where people are making consenting decisions. Moving on to the second part of the debate, though. Why do we think allowing this choice, if a lot of people opt into it, even if it's not particularly consenting, because we'll take that harder burden in this debate, why do we think this choice is socially beneficial? Firstly, people are in the aggregate, as I proved to you, better off because of increased utility. but moving on to the harder case. There are also specific ways in which these drugs improve moral behavior and make people happier and make our society a better place to live. People are often unable to make moral decisions because there are individual pressures that prevent them from doing so. When they are socially awkward and unable to speak in an empathetic manner, or they act in too selfish a manner because they feel that there are financial things like short-run financial incentives that stop them from giving to charity. When they are stand by and as a woman gets assaulted on a street because they are too afraid to jump in. When they are stand behind individual economic improvement and not the improvement of people who are poorer than them, especially in lower classes, that means that they are not acting in moral ways. These are particular impediments that mean individuals realize that they are not acting morally, that they are weighing up and balancing other kind of factors that are more short run and more individual. In the instance where these individuals are opting into these drugs, they are able to rationally and consentingly put aside these impediments because they weigh them up and say that they are not as important for them and that they want to be the person who intervenes when there is an assault on the street. They want to be the person. Oh yeah, I'm taking you out.
So you are concerned that social pressure restricts the moral choice of individuals. Do chemicals in the brain also restrict the moral choice of individuals?
Yeah, to some extent, but we think that is a choice that is legitimate and we make all the time, and people are better off for making those choices. To the extent that they get addicted to those drugs or they're particularly heinous, we wouldn't allow them on the market. Cool. Let's recognize the profound regret that people feel when these impediments are not able to be overcome, when they can't disrupt assault, go to church, or even opt into that social solidarity among classes. Our position encourages the perpetuation of that guilt. Not only does it make a less moral society where people are more likely to be bystanders to assaults and do less moral and objectively good things, it creates a society of regret, where they don't have particular access to those drugs, because those impediments are allowed to trump what people want to do in the long run. That where you wanted to be a moral actor, but in the short run you were unable to do so, that was particularly harmful. These guys said that there were bad outcomes. They said that you harm yourself by making selfless decisions. People can opt in to charity, to gifts, and make particularly negative, things that are negatively financial for themselves. We don't see how this functionally different in any manner. It is just over the longer run. They say that you can never return to who you are. That's fine. They say there's exploitation, but that you don't lose the ability to determine whether or not you're being duped. What instead we think this leads to is more people opting into socially progressive movements. They're not just having their money harvested by corporations. In fact, they're opting in, voting in a more moral wanted to do that we're unable to overcome. That's why we're very proud to oppose.
Right, we thank the Leader of Opposition. We call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
What we're able to show you in open government is that individuals are not going to be able to self-actualize for themselves because one, they put their own interests on the back burner for other people's interests, who they can't even help as well as they would do previously, because the only people who don't take these drugs are awful people, who these people now who do take these drugs can't call out anymore because they're altruistic to everyone and thus don't see that other people are doing horrific things. So firstly, just to clear up the confusion opening opposition have here, right? Because they tried to say, oh look, if these drugs, we're obviously going to put bad drugs on the market, that would be awful, right? Michael gives you a list of reasons why the incentive for these drugs to be as strong as possible would be provided, why there'd be huge amounts of pressure for these drugs to be taken on board. Moreover, what we say is on this idea of, in response, for example, to the POI Ashish gives, these guys acknowledge that the drugs could be really bad, right? And they say, aha, we won't put those particular drugs on the market. But the key factor is you won't know in advance that those drugs are really bad. Is how do you test that those drugs are having an irrational, unnatural impact on an individual's brain and like forcing them to be wholly altruistic at the expense of all like actual end goals of altruism, given that the whole point of this drug is to increase altruism unnaturally. We think that's a huge problem on their side, which they're not willing to engage with, right? So firstly, I want to look at this idea about why is it that the market, expanding what Michael said about why markets will provide these kinds of things, right? First of all, why this harms an individual's self-interest. The first thing is, no, thank you, Crash. The first thing on this is that actually people generally at the moment actually know what's best for themselves. We agree with these guys on this side of the house. So for example, I may know that what's best for me at this moment in time is to actually go out and so, for example, spend some time on my education to get a better job so I can help myself, and also if I want to self-actualize by helping other people, also help other people. The problem with this drug, however, is I will take this drug thinking this will be able to help me help other people. But what I will think at that time of, like, do I go and do some extra study and help people in the long run? Or do I, for example, do some volunteer work now, or go out and help beggars in the street or clean up some mess? That seems to be a far more likely decision now on this side of the house. Why is that? Because the level of altruism in that act is so much clearer to me. I need to help someone. I need to help someone now. And I do the thing that most obviously satisfies that goal by doing something which actually is not productive in the long term of helping these people, as opposed to the alternative, which I otherwise would have done, which is get a better education and solve the systemic problems that Crash and Toby want to talk about in closing. Go for it, closing.
Yeah. So there's nothing about altruism that means you can't call people out, especially when they're doing significant amounts of social harm to people who you care about. If anything, it makes you more desiring to do
so the definition of altruism is caring about people, right? And the thing is, you, for example, at the moment, I can be altruistic. The problem with this then is that if you're wholly altruistic, when other people are oppressing other people, you still care about the oppressors, and therefore you're unable to do so. What you need to show is for sure, why is it that these drugs will definitely be ones which you're able to like determine between like good people and bad people, and use your altruism in good ways some way, but not be altruistic to bad people in other ways. And that's what we say is harmed as opposed to the current situation, right? Moreover, what we say is that altruism becomes circular, because we say good people who want to help other people take these drugs, but the problem is they can't actually tell one another what they need to help, what they need to be in order for themselves to be helped, because they want to help other people. This is what Michael tells you, which goes completely unresponded to. Moreover, what we say on this particular issue is that it actively harms those people who want to help other people. Why is that? Which kind of people won't take these drugs? Bad people, right, under their model, or in our world, people who decide they don't want to help other people, which we think is a perfectly legitimate decision, because that's the world we live in, and we haven't chosen, for example, to be born. We haven't chosen to, for example, be in a more privileged position than others. It's unclear, and these guys acknowledge and opening up that like people self-actualize in different ways. But why is it that if I choose to help other people, that's harmful, that I am on these drugs, and those who want to harm other people aren't on these drugs? The reason it's harmful is for the reasons Michael gives you, and the reasons we expand on, which is the idea that it becomes far harder for me to criticize, right? The only contention these guys have is maybe these drugs will be produced in a way where, for example, I can see that other people are being oppressed, and therefore I want to help them, right? That's their contention. Well, why is it certainly not for sure that that may not happen? The first thing is exactly what these guys said, and I expanded on in rebuttal, which is you don't know the impact of this drug. You don't know what kind of altruism you're going to have, given you can, by definition, be altruistic to bad people, right? This is what we see. People commit awful, heinous crimes, and people are altruistic and empathetic and say, look, I understand why you massacred those, 100 children, and I want to help you with that, right? Rather than say what you did is so awful. We say that's incredibly damaging when the worst members of society aren't on those drugs, because they continue able, and even more so than they are at the moment, to oppress individuals, and actually are far more unlikely to be called out on it. The second reason is the one expanding on what was brought you as well, is this idea that actually, in order to achieve long-term change, you actually have to invest in long-term changes, right? But why is that harder to do now? The reason that's harder to do now is that in order for people to, for example, be willing to lobby other groups, we put a huge amount of political pressure on awful parties and for the politics to help these individuals. They need to believe that that act is the the one that's going to help them the most. But that's far harder now when you use drugs to suppress other parts of the, like potentially suppress other parts of the rationale, right? Because for the reasons I've stated, why it's actually far easier to believe that the easiest way to help is by giving a beggar £5 rather than saving up all of that money to, for example, invest in like slogans to say we should help all beggars and things, because it gives you that feeling that I'm helping that person directly rather than investing long term to help them in the future, right? Moreover, what we tell you is that it leads to situations, excuse me, it leads to situations where actually those other individuals who want to self-actualize in a way that, like for example, those individuals who don't want to take these drugs are often forced to take them to these drugs, right? These guys say, oh, no, people can make decisions for themselves. Michael gives you a list of reasons why that's not true. One of the key ones is, like, let's be honest, when we saw this motion, right, the initial thing thought is like, why is this a bad idea, right? The reason is because Crash, much like Crash, most of us aren't misunderstood what altruism means. We think it means that we only ever do good things to good people. But the problem is, that's what people think when they take the job in the first place. They're not able to go through all of the steps we've talked you through to acknowledge that actually in the long term, this could be potentially really harmful. This is the same reason why we ban lots of other things such as active recreational drug in situations. People aren't able to be aware of it. Moreover, lots of people will come off the drugs at some point, maybe due to side effects or something else, but then they won't realize why they've done all of these altruistic things in the past, given away all of their money like in order to help other people, because it wasn't natural altruism which was built up. It was this drug. Therefore, that destroys that person because they haven't got a clue why they've ruined their life for others who they don't actually naturally care about in the future. The question at the end of the debate is quite straightforward. Do we risk ruining what we have at the moment, where we are achieving social change in a positive manner, by throwing it all away at the cost of actually leading to eternal oppression, because people who want to help are screwed over and those who don't want to help are empowered? We say no. Couldn't be prouder to propose.
Right, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister. We call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Mr. Speaker, we hear from opening government that people will sacrifice their own self-interest for others when they take this drug, and that is why it is bad for those individuals. That's important because they miss the analysis that we gave, that every time they consume this drug, they take a decision to consent to the effects of that drug. Here is where the choice becomes comparative in this debate. Under our model, maybe people take a drug, maybe they do regret the effects that that drug has on them on the first time that they use it. But at least they have the choice, they have information of whether that drug made them act better or worse, to be able to make a decision next time to act more morally or better in their interest, recognizing that sometimes they do want to act not in their self-interest. Under their side of the house, they never know what it is to take that drug. They never know that experience, so they lack the information to be able to adjudicate the benefits or the harms of that decision. We weren't requiring that people took these drugs. We supported the government alleviating conditions that coerced people into taking them, but we would rather recognize the state intervening to ban the production and research into these drugs was the worst way to ensure people could consent to making decisions that were in their best interest. No, thank you. I'm going to deal with two issues in rebuttal. The first was on individuals' access to rights in this debate, which we thought were trampled upon by opening government side, and second, about the outcomes that this model would produce. On the first question of people's access to rights, we hear the absurd notion that people lose their personhood once chemicals, or particularly different chemicals in this debate, start interacting with their bodies. We say that's absurd because all the time people interrelate with chemicals that already existed in their bodies, new chemicals that they take on in ways that change them but don't lose them in this personhood sense. We recognize that closing is probably going to have a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of the way in which chemicals interact with people. We hear in a point of information that the existence of chemicals in the first place in people's brains limits people's choice in the first place. Here is why our case is more nuanced than that. It says that yes, there are conditions that make people's freedom imperfect under the status quo, but when you give people full control or most control over their capacity to control which chemicals enter them and which chemicals leave them, that is where they're able to optimize their capacity for freedom in this debate. And that is where, on enacting that freedom, they're able to be most happy. That is why we win on the question of those rights and that freedom. No, thank you. We hear from them, secondly, that self-interest is compromised when people are only worrying about other people. Firstly, we think people are more likely to demand drugs that make them more empathetic to people who are suffering more. No, thank you. That's the likely direction of innovation that the market would likely spur. No, thank you. They say that, we live in this world where it's conceivable that we create drugs that create empathy, Mr. Speaker. We don't know why it is so unbelievable that there couldn't be nuances to the type of empathy that those drugs designed would ultimately create. But furthermore, we say that so long as you've consented to making that charitable action, we reject it just because it isn't in your, for example, financial best interest to give someone money if they're poor. That doesn't necessarily make you better off or more happy. Firstly, because you might literally just become happier for the fact that that other person is better off. But secondly, when people invest so much of their lives in the purpose and function of morality and how that defines themselves, it's important to them that they act morally. So when they talk about people's pressure to take these drugs, what was a more relevant pressure in this debate was people's pressure to act morally. Because when they couldn't act morally for short-term biased incentives under the status quo, they needed these drugs in order to be happier overall by feeling less guilty about decisions that they made. That's the second issue. It's about outcomes. It's people's capacity to act on that capacity to want to exercise their free will. We hear from their side that the definition of altruism is complex. It surely is, but it should be up to individuals to make the choice as to how to navigate that subjective rationality and that subjective morality. Which drug they want to consume to change their psyche, the morality that defines their behavior. What James brought to you that wasn't sufficiently responded to by them was to say that often, even if somebody doesn't stop harassment taking place in the street, it doesn't mean they might not regret not stopping that harassment from taking place. That is to say, they would be better off, they would be happier, they would feel like they'd been more moral if they'd done that, but they didn't. No, thank you. That's a failure under the status quo due to reasons like social inhibitions that these chemical drugs might be able to help these individuals to overcome, so that ultimately they're happier, and ultimately those disadvantaged people are better off, so that that woman doesn't get harassed into the street. We say further, there are broader social impacts of this. For example, the capacity of some poor people to care about other poor people in the interest of broader social solidarity and the uplifting of people who don't necessarily see their collective interest in the short term, but see it in the long term, that thank you, when they have access to chemicals that can change their capacity to make decisions in the interest that they predefine as in their interest, even if they can't always stick to the rules that they defined in the first place. I'll take closing if you have one.
If the metric for this debate is, as your leader of the opposition points out, that morality is in some sense subjective, why do you think these social benefits are so important? Could you make that link explicit?
Oh, definitely not. We said that this debate should be decided on the capacity of individuals to consent to subjective morality. It was our case that the problem of the opening government's case was that they defined, to some extent, morality as objective and never let individuals enact their freedom to choose which morality they wanted to operate under, which meant, importantly, that a lot of individuals would choose to act altruistically. It was their choice to do that. That would lead to social benefits, the second theme I'm discussing, which is like an extra benefit we get under our case. But the main point is that we get the benefit of freedom to those individuals from being able to enact their conception of morality. No, thank you, you're out of order, actually. So, on my final point about the violation of the principle and free speech of science and scientists, and this also relates to conceptions of morality to some extent. We said that even if drugs aren't eventually produced, we have proposed the government banning their research and development. That's for three reasons. Firstly, you shouldn't suppress speech in the pursuit of scientific truth and knowledge, particularly to the extent that that science might interrelate to people's conceptions and understandings of their morality. If they learn to understand that changes in chemicals could change their behavior, they might learn to re-understand and redefine what exactly is moral behavior, and they have a right to access that information for that research to exist rather than the state condemning it to inexistent. Secondly, there's a problematic chilling effect against research when potential implications of scientific research could be a drug that maybe changed chemicals in your brain that maybe change the morality of your behavior, and we reject that that's a good thing to chill against. But thirdly, it often aids in other scientific research to understand the way in which chemicals might relate to people's moral inhibitions, because those moral inhibitions are also to some extent behavioral. That relates to all kinds of scientific research that we do not stand for suppressing. This debate is about the capacity of individuals to consent to a morality that they chose. They were choosing that when the state wasn't inhibiting their right to make that choice. We were very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and that concludes the opening half. Kick off the back half and call upon the member of GAL. Yeah.
So side opposition stands tall, they stand proud. Morality is subjective and people need to have freedom. But yet their vision of human nature is that it's just a bag of chemicals. You put some chemicals in and you take some chemicals out. We in chosen government have a slightly more dignified vision of how moral decisions work, and we think that characterization of moral decision making was utterly inappropriate. In my extension, I want to focus very explicitly on the moral core of this case, why this is not a valid way in which people make moral decisions. That's why my first point of extension is about choice. My second one is going to be about outcomes. Why, even if we assume the utilitarian framework they want to talk about at some points, but not at others, this is a terrible thing to allow. One point of rebuttal, the rest will be integrated. This thing about the rights of scientists. I don't think the rights of scientists are peculiarly important. They are a very small community, and they already have huge amounts of funding from the government and huge amounts of social influence. We need to weigh up their lack of freedom of speech against the huge harm to every single individual who will take this drug, in exactly the same way that we do not allow scientists to have research into iron facial shapes or racial characteristics to design society to become eugenically more desirable. Absolutely, we do not think that's appropriate. Other things like PET scans or tomography can do the same things too. First point of extension, therefore, choice. We think that these drugs damage choice because even if at the point at which you take that drug you have a choice, it damages your capacity to make every legitimate moral choice in the future after that point. No, thank you. And their analogies here were deeply disingenuous. The difference of every other situation here is this. When I decide to go and exercise or take alcohol, I'm making all those decisions according to a pre-existent moral metric that remains consistent over my life, right? No, thank you. The difference is once you take this drug, that moral metric changes. So the entire way in which you choose to stop taking that drug, no, thank you, has in itself been undermined because it's already changed the way you make your decision making, right? So the appropriate analogy would be this. Do we value the moral decisions of someone who is drunk? Because under their world, they would say, yes, this is just a chemical in your brain, it'll be fine. But we tend not to value the moral decisions of people who are drunk because we think that their free will has been subjugated to a chemical within their mind. So they do not have rational choice here. Secondly, we think there's a cyclical effect here, right? Because if you take a drug and you become more empathetic as a result, a natural consequence of that is that you want to develop your pre-existing moral capacity. So you say, well, I'm not donating as much as I should. I ought to do more. Then you have every incentive, given that your moral incentives have already been changed, to take more of these drugs, right? And unlike other drugs where you can assess the harms and say, well, my body is breaking down, moral harms cannot be assessed by objective things, right? You need a metric. But when you change the metric, the changing of the metric can't itself be a harm, because of course that metric is going to say changing a metric was good. So in an ontological sense, this is an inescapable fact. Thirdly, we say, under this, you prevent people from being able to reassess the life experiences and changing the morality according to that. One of the ways in which you reassess your morality is when you yourself cannot abide by it and you find it unpersuasive. So here's an example. Many utilitarians stop becoming utilitarians because they say, actually, I don't think I ought to give all my money to other people around the world. That seems an unreasonable burden for me to place on myself. Maybe some extent of self-interest is allowable in this moral metric, right? Because they examine their own life experiences and a capacity to abide by these. There's no meaningful re-examination of life experiences when all you do is set people on the path where they are always going to be taking these drugs. You also prevent them from engaging in the kind of experiences that will encourage them to change their moral beliefs. Why is it important to change people to change their moral beliefs? Because you might be wrong. And democracies work on the presumption that human beings are rational and free will and can adjust their preferences in response to new data. One of the analogies that we got from opening, we said, well, it's just like exercise, right? No, exercise does not change the core fundamental being of who you are and your vision of the moral universe. You get a nice high, that's kind of cute. It's different from deciding to become a more altruistic or left-wing person, guys. No, thank you. Furthermore, this does impact a person in a very fundamental way. But they have a clever counter-argument. They go, well, it's not a counterbalance because society tells you to be selfish, so we're just mitigating for that. Firstly, no, thank you. I give legal POIs. I understand you can frustrate it, but legal POIs, please. So the first thing I'd like to say is that we think that society already encourages quite a lot of empathy, right? Religious structures and familial structures where we naturally love and care for other individuals are ways in which we already encourage empathy. Furthermore, people are susceptible, even in capitalist economies, to rational argumentation. The fact you have massive left-wing parties that argue for big redistribution and nearly half the population supports them tells me that even if you like an iPod, you can still think that helping the poor is a good thing. It's unclear what is counterbalancing is needed. And even if the social pressures, you need to prove to me that only the people who are peculiarly subject to these social pressures will be the ones taking it. I suspect a lot of left-wing people who already empathize will be the ones taking these things because they're the ones who want to opt in the first place. So those social pressures were bizarre to talk about. Okay.
Can you explain why the moral framework you started off with is necessarily and objectively better than the one you end up with, such that you can't consent to change between them?
No, I can't. I'm just saying that free will, like you talk about, is valuable. And I'm saying that I'm happy to sacrifice the free will of a person who takes a drug in favor of his free will at all later points in time so he can consistently reevaluate his beliefs. That's why we stop people from taking things like heroin, for instance. It's fairly straightforward. So let's now talk about the outcomes of this, right? Is there anything else on the point? No, so nothing else on this point. Let's talk about outcomes. Let's assume that they want to talk about the world becoming better or helping the poor or having empathy people around the world. Ignoring the fact that this is already quite widespread, we don't think there's a systemic flaw in capitalism. I'd like to point out that manipulating people's emotions such that they sympathize with a lot of other people often does not help those people, even if you want to talk about that. The reason is this. Changing your reaction to something so that they become primarily emotional cuts out to some extent your rational capacity to evaluate whether or not a course of action is good or bad. So many left-wing individuals argue for large welfare states and argue for massive increase of provision to the poor. But it's unclear whether that's a good outcome for society as a whole, because the track record of welfare states at having sustainable debt burdens and being able to ensure the safety of future generations is actually quite bad, because that empathy for people who are suffering right now often crowds out considerations for more abstract entities like future generations, which are also agents of our moral caring. On a more brusque level, look at what's happening in charities right now, right? Whenever there's a drive to help charities in Africa, people donate tons of shoes, they donate tons of clothes. These are not the things that many of these people need, right? These are things like mosquito nets. All we end up doing in many of these charitable drives is just destroying local shoemakers or local clothes makers, and then these people are left with tons of clothes in the Western world, and they're just going, this is not helping any of us. The reaction of people with lots of empathy in society is often not been to help the people we want to help the most, and we think having some cynical or economically minded right-wing people around to guide our actions is often a good thing. Another cause and consequence is that you coerce everyone who does not want to subscribe to this belief. So if you have more people wanting for high taxation and welfare, you coerce every single libertarian in society who does not consent to that, who believes that taxation is theft, to taking away his choice or her choice on the basis of some chemicals that you put in your brain that constrain the decision-making forever. That's not how democracy ought to work, and that's certainly not how governments ought to manipulate the choice of individuals. For all these reasons, we have made the most basic moral case I'm very proud to propose.
Right, thank you, member of government, and call upon the member of opposition.
Society already shapes people and how they frame their moral judgments. At the point at which this happens, at the point at which we're giving people the option not just to choose something else within their own framework of desire, but to alter their framework of desire, you do need some metric by which to judge that. We think we can provide that metric inside closing opposition, and we think we're going to explain the systematic oppression of women through making them more caring, because that's what men tell them to be as a system of oppression, and why that is a reason to enforce this policy. First, I'm going to look very closely at what Ashish says about rationality, because the problem in this entire debate, people throw out the word rationality, okay, as if it's obvious what it means. What does rationality mean? It means you have to have some set of goals to which you work towards, goals. And then in achieving those goals, you are rational. Okay, so if I decide I want to be a billionaire, I might be rational if I go to all the McKinsey talks. Okay, but it is not then fair for me to say a religious person who sees their ultimate good as praying to God, being one with God, to tell them they are irrational not to go to the McKinsey talks because they have a different framework for evaluating their own life. What we have here is a way to change the framework of what matters to people. So suddenly now, screwing other people for my own gain isn't what gets me going. What gets me going is being nice to other people, being happy. Effectively have two different compasses and you're deciding which one to go with. It doesn't make sense to pick one or the other just because that individual wants it. Okay, we say so if you want to ban these drugs, okay, so let's say I am dickish Toby, I'm not very nice, and as a dick I would want to continue being nasty. Okay, there is a hypothetical nice Toby which could exist out there, which sees the ultimate aim of Toby as being a good member in society. At the point where they ban these drugs, they cut out nice Toby from being able to actualize in the way he wants and give that vision of where Toby should go. So how do you weigh up at this point? We say the state does these weigh-ups all the time. It does it in any policy. It does it in a policy which affects more than one person in a country. I may be really nasty and have a set of moral codes which leads to one thing. Crash may be a really lovely people and have a set of moral codes which goes to another thing. What the state does is says we've got to weigh up some way of deciding which one is good or bad. Now, which way to do that? Okay. This is where we think it is important to note that under the status quo, so OG had this wonderful thing, that at the moment, everyone freely opts into this like moral position they find themselves in and can self-actualize within this. This is a lie, a scientific lie. Under the status quo, brains are changed. It is a scientific fact that this happens to the environment. The word is neuroplasticity. Where does this happen? It happens particularly in women, okay, where you see as they develop, so when they are born, their brains are often quite similar to men. As girls grow older, there becomes increasing divergence, and the parts of the brain like related to like emotional empathy and so on become stronger and stronger and more developed as compared to men. Interestingly, this is a social phenomenon. That's why we see trans women having brains which develop in the same way as cis women, okay? How does this happen? It's when women are constantly told their caregivers, their mothers, they're the ones who are sympathetic in opposition to men, okay? And so we say, what that means is women don't just face external barriers from convicted men, they face internal barriers, where their own metric of what they want is determined by patriarchy. And even if you change those external barriers, those internal barriers still stay the same. So that's why you see Sheryl Sandberg saying that even when you have affirmative action policies for women to be on board and so on, they are still less caring, they're still less ruthless, they are still less driven, which allows men to continue to screw them over and to be the most successful, okay? And the people in these positions of power who don't have sympathy have the incentives to perpetuate these norms. That's why we see men continuing to tell women to be caring, to give everything up. Why? Because it gives them a free source of giving, which they don't need to give anything back to. It allows you to generate people who will give to you because they think they want it, and you don't have to give back. We see this happens in a range of communities. You see it in Afro-American communities where they are told, like capitalism does this. It creates the idea that there is a service class and then like people who should drive for things. That's why we see like middle class people having the confidence to go off and become the rich business executives, but not those in the very poorest communities. I will take a sheesh.
So you say that states decide all the time, and this is no different. But people freely vote for a state, and that gives the state power. When you change people's political metrics so that they don't vote freely, the state's not legitimate in making this decision.
Okay, Ashish, first of all, as I'm going to get onto, there's no apparent reason why people wouldn't support this policy under the status quo. You say the only source of morality is what people on average want. We say on average it's quite likely that the huge amounts of oppressed in the world would want a way to stop their oppressors screwing them over. Okay, so Why is what I've said so important, okay? Because at the point where this is a form of oppression which allows men to systematically screw over women, OG is incorrect to say everyone freely currently opts into like either being sympathetic or not. And it's so unfair to think of anything which changes them. No, this is not the case. What we say in Closing Law is that there is already a distribution of empathy, but that distribution cannot be avoided, but it is unequal. We say in Closing Law, if that distribution is to exist, the very best thing we can do is to at least make it equal. What is the way this is going to happen? We say, first of all, the state has a big incentive to like encourage these things, to encourage policies which might do this. We don't know exactly what they look like, but we think they can happen. And we think, so Open and Gov are wrong to say it's going to be like all the elites forcing this on the minor people, okay? Why? Because the state wants the people who aren't buying into society, often the richest and most powerful, to buy in because it makes the state better and gives it more resources. When rich people don't want to dodge taxes because they care about other people, when companies aren't trying to commit fraud, which states have to heavily regulate, because they just care about society, that's massively in the state's interest. You could get programs like distribution in schools in a mass level. Furthermore, we say there's mass take-up. For as like more and more people are encouraged to do this, more and more people become altruistic. And then as more and more people become altruistic, there's more demand for this to happen. Okay, so what have I said? I've said what we are talking about is changing the way, giving the individual the option to change the way they evaluate their lives. At the point you have completely different metrics, it becomes bizarre to talk about individual rationality. Instead, we need to look at the bigger picture, that at the moment empathy is unfairly distributed and oppressive, and that we must stop that. I am very proud to oppose.
Right, we thank the member of opposition and the call for the Gov. Yeah.
We good?
Yeah, we're good.
We are told by the opposition bench that these drugs allow people to be who they want to be. I want to be a nice person. I don't want to stand by and watch bad stuff happening, so I will take these drugs. Ashish points out the two flaws in this point of view. The first is that you cannot reasonably control the extent to which you are made to be nice, because this drug is self-propagating. There's people who are empathetic want to be more empathetic, so will be pushed to take this drug. But the second and more important point he tells you is that it prevents your ability to change and decide who you want to be. Recognize that that is something that evolves over the course of your life and isn't something that you are simply born with. You lock people into the morality they have when they start taking these drugs, rather than giving them a genuine opportunity to reassess their preferences and live the lives they want, which is the metric you set for themselves. Three things in this speech. First, a direct response to the stuff we heard from the previous speaker, then how you can't control the extent to which you implement your morality, and then finally, how you can't choose said morality. First off, response to the closing opposition. They spoke about two things, rationality and gendered roles, and I'll address each in turn. But first, I think in responding to closing opposition, it's worth reminding them what opening opposition said. The leader of the opposition pointed out at the beginning of his speech that morality was subjective. He then said some stuff about social benefits later on in his speech. I asked Tyrone, reasonably I think, how these two things interacted. And Tyrone said the real metric for this debate is in fact individuals deciding their own morality, and that these other social benefits are secondary. So if we can win the point about individuals choosing and implementing their own morality, we win this debate. Why does this interact, no thank you, with what the closing opposition says? Because when they start talking about morality, they commit a basic fallacy. The key thing to note is that even if we buy your conception of rationality, namely that it is about achieving moral goals that already exist, the point is that those moral goals change over time, that you prevent individuals from reassessing those preferences. That's what Ashish told you in extension, and what you ignored with this point. But the second thing to say is that when they talk about nice Toby and nasty Toby and how we're privileging one over the other, and that there's no arbitrary distinction between the two of them, they miss the point in this debate. Because openings say that there is a Toby that is the real Toby, right? The Toby who is the proper actualization of the moral Toby. That is the premise of the opening opposition's case, that you have some inherent self and some inherent morality that needs to come out. So when you say that it's simply just arbitrary, you implicitly knife your own opening. The final thing they say, well, the state makes decisions about morality, but the point is the state is the aggregated preferences of all individuals in democratic society, and that's why it's legitimate, because it takes together everyone's subjective morality rather than just having moral fiat by virtue of being the government. Then they say something interesting. They say, the thing is, women are socialized into being more empathetic with men, and this forces them into gender roles. I think this is an interesting point, but I think it misses the point of who is actually going to take these drugs, right? There are two things to note about this. The first is that if you are more empathetic, you presumably care about caring. That means you're more likely to take drugs that make you more caring, make you more altruistic, and make you more faithful to that system. So if women are more empathetic, they are much more likely to take these drugs in the first place. Why does this matter? Because their point was a distributional point. They were saying women are on average more empathetic, which means they're often pushed into these gendered roles. Whereas if women take the drugs more than men, that average disparity still remains the case, so women still get socialized into these more empathetic roles. Right? Sure, men are more empathetic, but women are much more empathetic, so they will still take. But the second thing to point out is you have just given men the ultimate tool for patriarchal oppression. If it is true that women being empathetic upholds patriarchy, which hugely benefits men, if I'm a man, I am much more likely to pressure women into taking this drug because I know they will help me out much more and fulfill these gender roles that propagate my lifestyle, right? What's this going to look like? It's going to be like, you need to take care of the kids better, so take this pill, right? That sort of pressuring is absolutely obscene and makes patriarchy worse. So that argument simply doesn't work. It rules the distribution of who will actually take these pills. That was a nice and interesting idea. Let's talk then about the implementation of an individual's moral point of view, because Ashish gives you, I think, an excellent argument about why these drugs are addictive that gets no response. I think opening reasonable to say that they want individuals to implement their own morality. Okay, but I want to be an altruistic person to an extent. I probably do care about that individual getting sexually assaulted in the street. I might not necessarily care about the kitty being caught up a tree, right? The important thing to know is that there is an extent to which I want to calibrate my morality, but you can't necessarily control the extent to which you can with these drugs. Why? Because if I am an ethical person and I am altruistic, I'm going to want to take drugs that make me better able to implement that system, right? That make me more faithful to that system and make me more empathetic and altruistic. Crucially, what that means is I'm likely to take more of these drugs and take them for longer. And the more of these drugs I take, the more likely I am to take them for longer. That means that you as an individual are always getting pushed to take more drugs. And this is different from what opening said, right? They talk about social pressure, contingent factors. This is inherent to the chemical structure of the drug and what it makes you do. So it's a much more powerful argument then within the context of this debate. Opening have one interesting preemptive response. They do a regulated control thing. But I ignores one, the fact that if you want to ban these drugs from being addictive, they are all addictive, so you miss the point of use effect. But the second thing to point out is that you can never realistically control the amount that someone takes. Why? Because for something like a chemical drug, there is a physiological symptom that I am overdosing, right? The point is, there is no such thing that you can see in this case. There is no right or wrong answer to how much of this drug I have. The only way you can know is that it's subjective, right? And doctors can't make that adjudication. You can't realistically control this. I'll take closing now.
If morality is subjective, how is there any moral metric to judge this debate?
Whether or not people are able to actualize their own subjective preferences, like the one your opening set out. So let's talk then about people's ability to decide those moral preferences. It's worth noting that if they can't even decide their moral preferences, the question of actualizing them, which is what opening hung their hat on in this debate, is a moot one. What we are told by Ashish right from the get-go is that the way people make moral decisions is by constantly reassessing their moral preferences as their experience evolves and as their intuitions change over time. And it's worth noting that that's a change that happens quite a lot. You need only look at people who grew up in Catholic communities whose morality shifts over the course of their lives as an example of this. Two ways in which you prevent people from forming their moral views through this evolutionary process. Number one, people are just less likely to think about alternative metrics of morality, to the point at which you give them a drug that makes them, and I quote the info slide, more adherent to existing moral codes that they already have. Right? So by definition, you stop people from reassessing their preferences. That's not just preferences about selfishness versus empathy, right? These are preferences about all moral views, like whether or not I'm a Catholic, when I think about abortion, all these different questions, right? You make them obedient to all of them. So that's a problem. But the second key problem here is you also prevent people from having experiences that transgress those moral codes. Crucially, it's often by experiencing breaking the rules that I understand that that is an okay thing for me, it's something that actually gives me considerable satisfaction. The way this plays out in self-interest versus empathy is that by being selfish and getting some personal fulfillment from that, I may actually decide that it's more important to me, my empathy. That's something I can only know by experiencing it. But the drug stops you from experiencing it in the first place. Opening up says something interesting. They say, we want to override the short impulses people have to distract them from their moral points of view. That ignores the capacity of people to change their moral points of view as their lives go on. But more than that, it assumes you control the extent to which you take these drugs, which we don't buy. For all these reasons, the prop op doesn't work, and these drugs are something that should be stopped. Propose.
Right? We thank the Gov for the Gov bench and call upon the opposition whip to stay here.
What we told you in closing opposition is that the entire proposition bench has been bizarrely fetishizing the preferences and moral outlook that people are born with. There is no good reason, right? They privilege this, and their entire case is grounded in these arguments about self-actualization. But the truth is, this isn't even your own preference. It's one that you have no control over. It's one that you happen to be born with. And we see no value to it, right? Especially because these preferences, or not even preferences, whether or not you're empathetic or selfless, are not even just randomly distributed, but they are a way of sustaining power. They want to say that women should care about maintaining their own selflessness, and men should care about maintaining their own selfishness as if that's good in and of itself. No, women should fight back and resist all these things that are conditioning their inequality. That was the case we brought on closing opposition. Like, that's why we won this debate. In my speech, I'm going to look at three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about this bizarre principle about self-actualization, about how we do need to be talking about social outcomes in order to fairly come to a conclusion in a debate like this. No, thank you. Secondly, I'm going to speak to you about, and then the second area I'm going to look at is like the extent to which these social outcomes would accrue, right? Because like propositions say the debate wasn't about this. They talked a lot about this. They talked about right-wingers. They talked about giving all your money to the homeless. Social outcomes do matter, and we clearly win them on side closing opposition. Okay, so firstly, is there any water in this principle of self-realization? Okay, what we said on side, no thank you, closing opposition, is just how in control are you, right, of these original desires or original brain setup that you have? You are not in control at all. You do not choose it, and furthermore, it's symptomatic of your own oppression. So, so when we hear things like "you're not the same person anymore," we don't understand why there has to be a specific value on the original person you were, rather than the person that you became. So opening proposition say the issue is that you can't go back if you make these decisions. I mean, you possibly can go back. We don't know what these drugs are going to look like and what happens if you stop taking them. I mean, that's all very hypothetical at the moment. But I mean, beyond that, like they also said these drugs will change your mind, right? So that you won't want to be the person because of the person who you are. What they didn't tell us on side proposition is any reason to believe that the person you become after you take these drugs is any more likely to be wrong than the person you were before you took those drugs. We think both those people are equally credible in making a decision. Why preference one over the other? In fact, I mean, the future you is actually more moral, so maybe they're more likely to be right about whether or not they're you. And no, right? We are happy to say that it is not just a different ontological circumstance to be more moral. We are happy to say it is a good thing when people don't put themselves first in front of others, like in an immoral way. Like that is in general a moral flaw. Happy to do that. I mean, not in a very absolute sense, but in general, we think it is really bad when people ignore the preferences of others in their decision making, even if they don't have to give them equal weight. Okay. And then finally, and closing propositions basically repeat this analysis, but they say what they're happy is people making any decision when their moral criterion changes. Notice, like, I can choose to go to university, right? And I make that choice thinking, like, and I'll probably come up, especially if I study philosophy, which I do, with a very different ethical worldview. Still a perfectly legitimate decision for me to make. The only difference is there's a chemical doing this rather than life experience, but the point is life experience shapes your brain. This was Toby's neuroplasticity point. Social conditioning shapes your brain, much like drugs do. So those things are perfectly equivalent in this circumstance, unless they want to stop people from going to universities. If they want people to reconceptualize their life choices, these drugs do it, right? And that's how the model works, right? No, thank you. So the second area is like, would this be good? We think there was a misunderstanding of what altruism is throughout this debate, okay? And Toby pointed this out, right? So we think that altruism is it's not necessarily even having like ultimate sympathy. It's worth pointing out that like really extreme drugs that made you only care about other people just as much as you care about yourself would have no market in this future world. It would at most be like a marginal improvement to bring you close to the level of people who are quite empathetic at the moment, right? So let's not get too extreme here. But the main thing is that you can't make exceptions for yourself, right? You don't have to become a complete utilitarian. You might care about things like justice. You might care about things like redistribution and fairness. But the point is you can't accept yourself, right? You can't just make this a non-moral decision because you are inconvenienced by the morality of the decision. That's what we see this altruism doing. So it actually makes people more moral in general. No, thank you. Okay. So when they talk about things like the homeless or the right wing, you can still be right wing under this policy. You just have to not be right wing for selfish reasons, right? You just have to not be like, like we're happy like for this policy to stop people being left wing and stupid. That's to do with education. If they don't understand the full impacts of left wing policies, that's just to do with being dumb, not to do with being immoral. You can be right wing, but you have to be right wing because you care about other people and not because you want undue privileges for yourself. That's the difference. Ashish. Sorry, no, I'll take opening.
Okay, so we explain how social pressure will force altruistic people into taking this drug. The patriarchy will thus pressure women into taking these drugs.
Okay, women, thanks. So, okay, no, thank you. So we talked about that. I mean, this was Ashish's point, so it's like good use of POI. But on this area, which is the feminist stuff, there were 2 points to the feminist stuff. First of all, which wasn't engaged with at all by Michael, just to show that insofar as morality is socially constructed, there is literally no difference between the morality of these drugs affecting your brain or social conditioning affecting your brain, right? Those two things are equivalent. The advantage of these drugs is that we finally have a tool to make more equitable the distribution of selfishness and selflessness. And that's not necessarily to do with making women more selfish. It's much more likely to do with men being made more selfless, right? But, no, thank you. The point of this point, so the only response is, well, this would never happen. Men would just take all the drugs, and then they'd be even worse off than they were before. I mean, like dystopia was the only solution, right, for them, for this policy. Things like, we can't advocate policies that could emerge in the distant future once all this research has been done. Something that could be likely is in the same way that governments use education in schools to make people more moral, right? That exists, and that was like an analogy that was completely ignored by side proposition. They could also encourage people to take these drugs in schools. Notice we do that with vaccinations, which was an example that opening government were happy to stand by, but they said that's different because there are social benefits to that, whereas there wouldn't be social benefits to these drugs. Given that we've now won the social benefits argument, we say that these are exactly the same as requiring kids to get vaccinated. The point is there are lots of different ways these drugs could be used, but what we do see is, especially in the developed countries, which are the ones that are being likely to have access to these drugs, is lots of intrusive measures by governments to promote the total goal of gender equality. So that point's also onto your opposition. But if you want some other incentives, you could look at the fact that more men commit crime, which is a huge problem for the states, and they do so exactly for these selfish, impulsive reasons because they don't care about other people. So there are lots of reasons to think that states have good incentives, either because they care about gender equality, they do quotas, or because they care about not screwing men over. But the point is, if we ban this research, we never have this tool. Toby pointed out that this tool was necessary to ever have full gender equality, so we can never have it without it, because you never get rid of women's internal constraints and men's internal constraints. On those grounds, we won on type 2 closing opposition. We beg to oppose.
I want to thank all of your team, for their hands, and thank you.
That's not.
Thanks.
Yeah, you left your paper on the ground.
Let's go.
I don't know. Miss